The crack of Jean Marchand's palm against his wife's cheek cut through the howling April wind like a rifle shot. Bertha collapsed to her knees on the dirt floor of their ramshackle cabin, her hands instinctively protecting the precious cargo beneath her heart twins, who kicked restlessly as if sensing their mother's terror. The red handprint bloomed across her pale skin like a desert flower joining the constellation of purple bruises that mapped her husband's escalating rage. Not again, she thought desperately. The same prayer she'd whispered every day for the past 6 months. Please, not the babies. The children in her womb seemed to respond to her fear, their movements becoming more agitated as another wave of pain, not from the blow, but from premature contractions, gripped her swollen belly. She had learned to recognize the warning signs and the tightening in her lower back, the cramping that spoke of labor beginning too soon. Tonight felt different, more dangerous, as if her body had finally reached its breaking point. Worthless piece of trash. Gene snarled his laudanum-thickened words, slurring together as he raised his hand again. Can't even keep a decent house. Can't cook worth a damn. And now you're going to birth me more mouths to feed that I can't afford. The figure standing in their doorway seemed carved from the storm itself. Nayati, known to whites as Red Hawk, towered 6 feet in buckskin and beadwork that spoke of the northern plains. Eagle feathers adorned his dark braids, and a war club hung silent at his hip. But it was his eyes that made Gene's hand freeze halfway to his cold dark, as winter nights holding the patience of a hunter who had tracked wounded prey across endless miles. What John couldn't see was the subtle scar along the warrior's collarbone, nearly invisible beneath his shirt, evidence of a knife wound that should have killed him. But hadn't, thanks to knowledge passed down through generations of Cheyenne healers, who understood that sometimes survival required appearing dead. The year was 1887, and the Arizona Territory baked under a drought that split the earth like broken pottery. What little grass survived stood bleached as old bones, while creek beds held nothing but cracked mud, and the occasional buzzard picking at something that had crawled there to die. The Southern Pacific Railroad pushed relentlessly westward, bringing with it survey crews' mining claims, and the kind of men who saw opportunity in other people's desperation. Bertha's sharp intake of breath fractured the silence as another contraction seized her with iron claws. At 26, she had once been a Philadelphia schoolteacher with gentle hands and dreams of frontier education. Her father had been a professor of literature, her mother a suffragist who had taught her that women possess strength beyond what society expected them to demonstrate. Now her cornflower eyes held the hollow recognition of a woman who had learned that screaming only made things worse, that survival sometimes meant enduring the unendurable, until a moment of opportunity presented itself. Nayati took in the scene with a warrior's trained assessment, but something deeper stirred in his chest as his gaze met Bertha's frightened blue eyes. He had seen brutality before, had even been responsible for it in his younger days. But there was something about this woman's quiet courage in the face of violence that reached past his carefully constructed defenses. The way she held herself protective of the children she carried, but not entirely broken, spoke of inner strength that hadn't been completely crushed by circumstance. 3 years ago, he had killed a man in a moment of rage, a brutal driver named Thomas Carnes, who had been beating his own horse to death for sport. The boy that DeVere left behind still haunted his dreams, leading to a sacred vow never to raise his hand in anger again, no matter the provocation. That oath had cost him standing among his own people, who saw his restraint as weakness in a world that respected only strength. But it had also taught him to find other ways to protect the innocent, subtler methods that sometimes proved more effective than direct confrontation. The warrior stumbled forward, one hand pressed to his forehead, his powerful frame swaying convincingly. Water. He croaked in heavily accented English, then collapsed to one knee with a groan that could have fooled death itself. But his collapse was calculated, positioning him between Bertha and her husband while appearing helpless, a technique he'd learned during his youth when subtlety mattered more than strength. As he fell, his eyes caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Fresh blood on Bertha's dress, not from external wounds, but from internal bleeding that suggested complications far more serious than a simple beating. The violence suspended like a held breath. John stood frozen, his colt half cleared from leather, uncertain whether this was collapse or cunning. Bertha stiffened as pain lanced through her swollen belly. The storm and stress had triggered something that shouldn't happen for another month. A tremendous gust slammed their door shut with a crash that rattled the entire structure. In that moment of thunderous noise, Bertha's waters broke, mixing with dust to create dark patches in the earth. Her face went white as January snow. But when her eyes met Nayati's again, something passed between them. An understanding that transcended race and circumstance, a recognition of souls tested by adversity and refined by suffering, blazes, and damnation. Jean muttered his gun and, suddenly uncertain, as the reality of his wife's condition penetrated the opium haze. His Eldynam adult brain finally registered what his eyes had been trying to tell him. His wife wasn't just hurt, she was birthing their children, and something was going very wrong. Nayati raised his head slowly, dark eyes holding Bertha's gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch despite her pain. In that shared glance, she saw not just protection, but something deeper. A man who understood suffering and had chosen to transform it into something meaningful. Someone who recognized the precious nature of the life she was fighting to bring into the world. "Please," Bertha whispered to no one and everyone, as another contraction seized her with devastating force. But her eyes never left the warrior's face, finding strength in his steady presence, drawing courage from the quiet certainty she saw there. The warrior slowly extended one hand toward John, palm up, and emptied a gesture of supplication that masked careful observation of the surveyor's weapons and positioning. "Water, for her," he said, his voice rougher now, more believable. "New life needs peace to enter this world safely. Bad spirits follow violence into the birthing place." Jean's weapon wavered as his wife's condition penetrated the chemical fog that usually cushioned his thoughts. The twins she carried represented more than just children to him, but they were potential assets, proof of his virility, possible solutions to debts that were crushing him beneath their weight. Finally, his hand dropped from his gun. He grabbed a tin cup and filled it from their water barrel, his movements jerky with withdrawal and rising panic. Nayati accepted it with both hands, a gesture of respect and humility that wasn't lost on either white person watching. He drank slowly, deliberately, using the time to study the cabin's interior and assess their resources. One door currently barred by nature's fury. One shuttered window. Surveying equipment stacked in the corner. Tools that should have made Jean prosperous, but had instead led him deeper into debt and desperation, to dangerous men who collected on obligations with interest that went far beyond money. But it was Bertha who commanded most of his attention, and despite her terror and pain, her hands moved with purpose, checking her pulse at the wrist, estimating the time between contractions, with knowledge that suggested she had helped other frontier women through similar trials. Most telling were the bruises covering her arms and throat, evidence of a pattern of violence that had been escalating for months. "Storm will pass," Nayati said quietly, his words directed at Jean, but his eyes never leaving Bertha's face. "Your woman needs peace for safe birthing. Violence brings cursed spirits that harm both mother and children." Jean's laugh held no humor, only the brittle edge of a man whose world was collapsing around him. "You think some savage, a historical slur voiced by antagonists, knows what's best for a white woman? You think His words shattered as Bertha's agonized cry filled the cabin, a sound that seemed to tear itself from her very soul. This contraction was stronger than the others, bending her completely double and leaving her gasping for breath when it finally released its hold. When she tried to straighten, more blood spotted her cotton dress. Not the normal signs of approaching birth, but something far more dangerous that spoke of complications that could kill both mother and children. Nayati was on his feet, instantly pretended weakness. Forgotten as medical urgency overrode tactical considerations. She bleeds wrong. Babies come too early. Without help, all three die. His voice carried absolute authority, but his hands, as he moved toward Bertha, were gentle as a whisper, careful not to cause additional alarm. The stark statement hit John like a physical blow, cutting through the ladanum haze with brutal clarity. For all his failures, the gambling, the drinking, the debts that had led him into increasingly desperate arrangements with increasingly dangerous men, he had married Bertha with genuine affection. She represented everything decent he'd lost when his surveying career went wrong, and he fell into Horace Blount's web of corruption and debt. The thought of losing her, of losing children, who might represent his last chance at redemption and respectability, sobered him faster than a bucket of creek water. "What do you know about birthing?" Jean demanded. But the hostility had drained from his voice, replaced by the desperation of a man who suddenly understood how much he stood to lose. "My people learn all healing," Nayati replied, simply kneeling beside Bertha with movements that radiated competence and calm authority. "In winter camps, when death stalks the lodges and the nearest help is many days away, everyone learns to fight for life. Women birth, men hunt, but when survival is at stake, all hands serve all purposes." He moved toward Bertha with careful steps, and when he knelt beside her, she instinctively leaned into his strength, recognizing something in his bearing that her abused instincts identified his safety. "May I help? I have delivered children before, saved both mothers and babies when the birthing went wrong." Bertha looked up through pain-laced eyes and nodded her breath, coming in short pants as she fought to stay conscious through the waves of agony washing over her. When his calloused but gentle fingers checked her pulse at throat and wrist, she didn't flinch. The first time in months, she had experienced a man's touch without fear. When he asked quiet questions about the timing of her contractions and the nature of her pain, she answered honestly, recognizing the professional competence in his voice. And when he helped her to the sleeping area, his touch was so careful, so protective, that something shifted in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with finding unexpected sanctuary in the midst of chaos. "Don't let him hurt them," she whispered, her fingers unconsciously curling around his wrist with surprising strength. "Whatever happens to me, whatever it costs, protect my babies. They're innocent. They deserve a chance to live." Nayati met her desperate gaze, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, the world contracted to just the two of them. A warrior who had sworn never to kill again, and a woman who had found the courage to fight for her children's future despite everything she had endured. Something passed between them in that instant, a connection that transcended race and circumstance, a recognition of kindred spirits who understood that some things were worth any sacrifice to preserve. "I give you my word," he said softly, and the promise bound him more completely than any chain or legal document ever could. "On the honor of my ancestors and the hope of generations yet unborn, I swear these children will live to see tomorrow's sun. Boil water," he commanded John with quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Clean cloth cut in strips for binding cords. Whiskey for cleaning hands, not drinking." His voice carried the kind of certainty that made men obey without question, the natural leadership of someone who had made life and death decisions under pressure and lived with the consequences. "Your woman fights for 3 lives now. Help her fight, or step away and let those who can serve do so. As Jean scrambled to obey his hands, shaking with withdrawal and terror, Nayati positioned himself so that Bertha could grip his hands during contractions. Each time pain seized her, their fingers intertwined with desperate strength, and something deeper than mere alliance took root between them. She found herself studying his face during the brief respites between waves of agony. The strong jawline that spoke of determination, and the intelligent eyes that held depths of experience and wisdom, and the careful way he monitored her breathing and adjusted his own to match hers, creating a rhythm of shared endurance that helped her maintain focus through the ordeal. The first baby emerged into Nayati's steady hands with a thin wail that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of the cabin. She was small, dangerously small, but her cry held fierce determination that spoke of the fighting spirit she had inherited from her mother. The warrior quickly cleared her airways with practiced efficiency and wrapped her in clean cloth, his movements so practiced and gentle that Bertha felt tears of gratitude blur her vision. "A daughter," he told her softly, placing the infant against her chest with reverence that transformed the moment into something sacred. Small, but her spirit burns bright as desert stars. She will be a fighter like her mother. The way he said it, with such profound respect for the new life they had brought into the world, made Bertha's heart skip, in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with recognizing something precious and unexpected in the midst of chaos. Through the walls they could hear the wind beginning to ease as the storm spent its fury against the unyielding landscape. But a new sound had joined the tempest's retreat, the distant rumble of approaching hoofbeats that grew steadily louder. Jean's face went ashen as recognition dawned, all color draining from his features as he understood what those sounds meant. "No, no, no," he muttered desperately, pressing his ear to the shuttered window as if hoping he might be mistaken about what he was hearing. "Not now. Not tonight. They can't come now." The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and low voices discussing strategy with the casual efficiency of men who had done this kind of work before. These weren't travelers seeking shelter from the storm. These were men with purpose, men who had ridden through the worst weather the territory could offer for reasons that had nothing to do with mercy or human decency. Nayati continued working with calm precision as the second baby began her journey into the world, his hands moving with the kind of practice skill that came from years of emergency deliveries in winter camps where mistakes meant death. This child was larger and stronger than her sister, but positioned wrong breech with complications that could strangle both mother and child if not handled with perfect timing and technique. His hands moved with surgical precision, and Bertha found herself watching those hands with something approaching awe, marveling at how something so strong and capable of violence could be so incredibly gentle when life hung in the balance. "Tell them to leave," Bertha gasped between contractions, but her eyes were on Nayati's face, drawing strength from his unshakable calm, finding hope in the quiet confidence she saw there. "Tell them we're birthing. Tell them anything." But John was already moving toward the door, his rifle clutched in trembling hands that could barely hold the weapon steady. "They won't listen. These are Horace Blount's men. And when Blount wants something, storms don't stop him. Birth doesn't stop him. Nothing stops him except getting what he came for." The name hit the cabin like a curse made manifest. Horace Blount, mine owner, territorial power broker, and puppet master of corruption that stretched from Tucson to Flagstaff like a spider's web designed to trap the unwary and desperate. What none of them knew was that Blount's interest in Jean went far beyond simple debt collection. That hidden in a strong box beneath the mine owner's office was a letter that would have explained everything, a letter addressed to my son Vernon and signed with a father's love. Despite years of estrangement that had driven the sheriff to take his mother's maiden name rather than acknowledge his connection to the territory's most powerful criminal. Heavy fists pounded on the door with increasing force, followed by a voice that cut through wood and wind like a blade designed for precisely this purpose. Jean Maron, open up. Mr. Blount's got business that won't wait for weather, or whatever else you might have going on in there. The second baby emerged just as the door splintered under repeated blows, her arrival coinciding with the destruction of their last barrier against the outside world. This child was stronger than her sister, announcing her presence with a lusty cry that declared her intention to survive whatever world she'd been born into, no matter how hostile or unwelcoming it might prove to be. Nayati worked frantically to clear airways and secure the umbilical cord, then wrapped both infants together as the shattered door swung open to admit the storm and something far more dangerous. Sheriff Vernon Carnes stepped through the wreckage with the measured pace of a man who was accustomed to having doors opened for him one way or another. He was flanked by 3 gunmen whose hard faces promised violence as casually as other men might promise good weather. And behind him came Pete Holloway, the territory's most skilled tracker, a man whose weathered features showed neither surprise nor emotion at the sight of newborn life in such circumstances. His badge gleamed in the firelight, but everyone in the room understood it was purchased rather than earned, a piece of metal that transformed private vengeance into public authority. Well, well. Carnes drawled his gaze, settling on Bertha and the newborns with the calculating attention of a man evaluating merchandise. Looks like we arrived just in time for the blessed event. Twin girls from the sound of it. That's a bonus Mr. Blount will appreciate. Jean's rifle wavered in his hands as he tried to find courage that had been drowned in laudanum and fear the weapons seeming to grow heavier with each passing second. This is my home, Carnes. You got no right to bust down my door and threaten my family. Rights. The sheriff's laugh was cold as winter wind. But there was something else beneath it, a bitterness that went deeper than professional duty, a personal grievance that had been festering for years. Mr. Blount owns your debt, which means he owns you and everything that belongs to you. His eyes never left the babies, but something flickered across his face when he looked at them. Not quite guilt, but something close to it, as if some part of him recognized the innocence he was about to destroy. Healthy white woman, twin daughters, all properly documented as territorial residents. That's valuable property in the right markets, especially when they come with the kind of papers that make questions unnecessary. The casual mention of human trafficking sent ice through Bertha's veins. But instead of cowering, she clutched her daughters closer and lifted her chin with defiance that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. My children belong to no one but themselves. They're not property to be bought and sold like livestock. Pete Holloway had been studying the scene with professional interest, his experienced eyes taking in details that others might miss. Now he spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by human cruelty. Sheriff, we got a problem here. That Indian's been watching us mighty careful, and he's positioned himself between us and the woman. Man doesn't do that unless he's planning something. Nayati had indeed been silent during this exchange, seemingly focused on tending mother and children while actually measuring distances, evaluating threats, and calculating odds with the cold precision of someone who had survived 30 years of frontier warfare. He'd been studying the men's weapons, their positioning, their body language, reading them like a hunter reads tracks, looking for weaknesses and opportunities that might preserve the lives he'd sworn to protect. When the nearest gunman took a step toward Bertha, the warrior moved with fluid grace that spoke of decades of training and combat experience. He didn't strike that would violate his sacred vow and likely result in immediate retaliation that would endanger the women and children. Instead, he simply stood and positioned himself between the threat and the family behind him. The movement so natural and protective that it seemed almost unconscious. As he did, Bertha caught sight of something she hadn't noticed before. In the way he favored his left side slightly, as if protecting an old injury, and the almost imperceptible scars along his neck that spoke of wounds that should have been fatal. There was something about those scars, about the careful way he moved, that suggested knowledge of survival techniques that went beyond normal human endurance. New mothers need rest, the warrior said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had delivered children in life or death situations before. Babies need warmth and peace. Men with guns bring evil spirits that curse fresh life. The gunman's hand dropped to his pistol grip with practiced ease. This ain't Indian business, Chief. Best you step aside before things get ugly. Nayati's response was calm as still water. But Bertha could see the slight tensing of muscles that suggested he was ready for violence despite his vow of peace. 3 lives just born under my watch. Old ways say that makes them my responsibility until they're strong enough to stand on their own. That makes it my business. Sheriff Carnes studied the Cheyenne with calculating eyes, and for just a moment, something flickered across his weathered features, a shadow of recognition that he quickly suppressed, as if remembering something from years past that he didn't want to examine too closely. There was something about this warrior's bearing, the proud way he held himself, despite the circumstances that stirred memories Carnes had tried hard to bury. But this was a man who had made choices and would stand by them regardless of consequences or complications. The sheriff was also a professional who understood when to press advantage and when to withdraw for tactical reasons. The cabin was small and crowded, the situation complicated by newborns who could be injured in any violence. And their primary objective was information and cooperation, not a body count that would draw unwanted federal attention. "We'll be back," Carnes announced, his voice carrying absolute certainty that made it more threat than promise. "Mr. Blount don't forget debts, and he sure don't forget people who interfere with his collections. All of you better think real careful about what you're getting yourselves into." But as he spoke, his eyes lingered on the babies with an expression that was almost paternal, a fleeting softness that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The gunman backed toward the door with disciplined caution, weapons ready but not drawn, moving with the coordinated precision of men who had worked together long enough to communicate without words. As they mounted up outside, their voices carried clearly through the broken doorway plans for returning with more men. Discussions of alternate approaches to the problem. Casual speculation about how much the woman and babies might bring from certain buyers who didn't ask questions about origins or circumstances. Only when the hoofbeats had faded completely into the storm-torn night did the tension in the cabin ease slightly. Jean slumped against the wall, his rifle finally lowering as the full magnitude of their situation became clear to him for the first time. "We're finished," he muttered, his voice breaking with the weight of despair and self-recrimination. "Blount owns half the territorial government. He'll be back with legal papers, federal warrants, whatever it takes to make this look official. There's nowhere we can run that his influence doesn't reach." But Nayati was already moving, gathering medical supplies and checking the baby's condition, with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. Not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining his healing trance. An ancient technique that allowed warriors to survive wounds that should have killed them by slowing heartbeat and breathing to near-death levels. "Then we don't wait for him to return. We take your family somewhere safe, somewhere his corruption can't reach." "Where?" Bertha asked, exhaustion making her voice barely audible. But when Nayati's eyes met hers, she felt that strange warmth again. The sense that this man would find a way to keep his promise, no matter what it cost him personally. The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. They all knew Blount's reach extended across the territory like a cancer, his network of corruption touching every town, every ranch, every official position that mattered in the administration of frontier justice. But as Nayati looked down at the two sleeping infants, then back at their mother, whose courage had humbled him more than any enemy he'd ever faced in combat, he began to formulate a plan that would either save them all or destroy him in the attempt. I know people who can help, but first, we need to move before they come back with reinforcements. Ruth Calloway heard the gunshots from 3 miles away, carried on wind that still gusted fitfully in the storm's wake, like the dying breath of some great beast. The widow didn't hesitate. She threw a saddle on her most reliable mount and rode hard toward the sound, her Winchester secured in its scabbard, and her weathered face set with the kind of determination that had kept her alive and prosperous through 3 decades of frontier hardship that had buried weaker souls. At 54, Ruth had buried 2 husbands to violence and disease, raised 3 children who had scattered to easier lives than the territory offered, and learned lessons about survival that couldn't be taught in any Eastern finishing school. Those lessons were written in scars that covered her weathered hands, in memories that haunted her sleep, and in instincts that had been honed by years of making life or death decisions with incomplete information and no time for second-guessing. She'd known Bertha was due to deliver soon. Frontier women kept track of such things since birth, and death were community affairs, whether you wanted them to be or not. She'd been planning to check on the young woman anyway once the storm passed. But gunfire near the Marchand cabin suggested complications that went far beyond difficult childbirth. What she found when she arrived was a scene of controlled chaos that told a story she'd seen too many times before. The cabin door hung from one hinge, splintered wood scattered across the threshold, like the remains of a brief but violent storm. Inside, a Cheyenne warrior she recognized from trading posts. Red Hawk, they called him, was tending to Bertha and 2 newborn babies with a gentle efficiency of someone who had delivered children under emergency conditions before. Bertha's relief was palpable. As the rancher dismounted and stepped through the wreckage, her presence immediately transforming the atmosphere in the small cabin. "Thank heaven you came. I wasn't sure anyone would hear." "Heard the shooting," Ruth replied tersely, taking in the situation with experienced eyes that missed nothing important. The fresh bruise on Bertha's face, the warrior's careful positioning between the white family and any potential threat from the doorway, the way Jean's hands shook as he tried to reload his rifle with fingers that had forgotten how to be steady. Carnes and his boys, Blount's collectors. Jean confirmed, his voice cracking with strain and the particular kind of fear that came from owing money to the wrong people. "They'll be back before dawn with more men. We're trapped here like rabbits in a hole, and there's nowhere to run that Blount's influence doesn't reach." Ruth studied the babies with the practiced eye of someone who had helped birth dozens of frontier children, both sleeping peacefully despite the chaos that had surrounded their entry into the world. Strong children, she judged with the kind of stubborn vitality that might carry them through whatever trials lay ahead. They would need that strength in the days to come, because the road ahead would test every assumption about what was possible in a territory where the law belonged to whoever could afford to buy it. "Can't stay here," she announced, with the practical certainty of someone who had survived by making hard decisions quickly and living with the consequences. "Too isolated, too exposed. Need to get these babies and their mother somewhere defensible before blown people returned with better weapons and worse intentions." "Where?" Nayati asked, looking up from his medical work. His dark eyes held intelligence and something else, the kind of quiet desperation that came from making promises that might prove impossible to keep from staking everything, on the hope that courage and determination could somehow overcome overwhelming odds. Ruth's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous the expression of a woman who had faced down, claimed jumpers, rustlers, and worse during her years on the frontier. Maybe Blount's influence reaches every settlement and every bought official in the territory. But it don't reach the federal government, and it sure don't reach the newspaper reporters who will be coming through Flagstaff next week for the railroad ceremony. The implications hit them all simultaneously, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The territorial governor would be arriving in Flagstaff to celebrate completion of another section of the Southern Pacific Railroad, bringing with him federal officials, Eastern investors, and most importantly, newspaper correspondents who would carry stories back to distant cities where Bloney couldn't buy silence and his threats couldn't reach. "You're talking about taking this public," Jean said. And for the first time in months, something like hope flickered in his bloodshot eyes, exposing the whole corrupt system in front of witnesses who can't be bought or intimidated. More than that, Ruth continued her mind, already working through the logistics and possibilities. "I'm talking about federal intervention, federal. The kind of attention that even territorial corruption can't sweep under the rug when it's being watched by reporters from New York and Washington. But first, they had to survive long enough to reach Flagstaff. And that meant moving immediately, despite the impossible circumstances. Bertha was in no condition to travel after a difficult twin birth. The babies were dangerously young for such a journey, and Blount men would be scouring every road and trail within 50 minutes before the sun rose again. "There's something else," Jean said quietly, his face pale with the weight of confession that had been building for months. "Something I should have told you from the beginning. Something that explains why Blount wants us so badly." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, drawing everyone's attention to the surveyor, who had been responsible for bringing this disaster down on all their heads. Ruth and Nayati both turned to look at him, recognizing the tone of a man about to reveal dangerous secrets that would change the stakes of their survival. "I wasn't just surveying land for Blount." Jean continued his words, coming faster, as if speed might lessen their impact. "I was mapping water rights, underground streams, hidden springs, aquifers, and sources that don't appear on any official territorial records. Every secret water source within a 100 miles of here." Ruth's face went stone cold as she grasped the implications with the speed of someone who had lived through enough frontier politics to understand how power really worked in the territory. Water rights are the foundation of everything out here. Whoever controls the water controls the entire territory. Jean finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "Blunt's been building a secret empire based on information I provided. He knows where every hidden source is located, which ranchers are vulnerable to drought, which towns will thrive, and which will die based on access to water that nobody else exists. He's been buying up land and positioning himself to control everything from Tucson to Flagstaff." The revelation transformed their understanding of what they were fighting, elevating it from a personal vendetta to something that threatened the entire future of the territory. This wasn't just about one family's debt or even human trafficking. This was about the systematic theft of an entire region's destiny, orchestrated through carefully gathered intelligence that Jean had provided in exchange for temporary relief from his gambling debts. "The surveys are hidden in a strong box behind our cabin." Bertha added, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. Jean was too frightened to keep them in the house, but too frightened to destroy them. If those records reached federal investigators, Blount's entire operation collapses. Ruth finished, her mind already working through the tactical implications of what they'd learned, along with every corrupt official who's been taking his money. Half the territorial government would fall, and the other half would be too scared to maintain the old ways. Nayati had been listening with the focused attention of a warrior hearing battle plans that would determine whether his people lived or died. Now he spoke with quiet certainty that carried the weight of absolute commitment to a cause larger than personal survival. Then we get the surveys to the investigators. But first, we get your family to safety. Without them, the evidence means nothing. The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks, requiring perfect timing and more luck than anyone had a right to expect. Ruth would escort Bertha and the babies to Flagstaff by back trails, staying off main roads where Blount searchers would be concentrated. Nayati would retrieve the strong box and create false trails to draw pursuit away from the real targets, using his knowledge of the territory and his skills as a warrior to buy them the time they needed to reach safety. "There's one more thing," Nayati said, as they prepared to separate, his dark eyes meeting Bertha's, with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat and her heart race with emotions she hadn't felt since her wedding day. "If something happens to me, if I don't make it to Flagstaff, promise me you'll keep fighting. Don't let fear make you surrender what we've already paid for in blood." The moment stretched between them, weighted with everything that couldn't be spoken aloud in a crowded cabin with other people listening. Bertha found herself memorizing his face, the strong jawline that spoke of determination and nobility, the intelligent eyes that held depths of experience and wisdom far beyond his years, the careful way he held himself with quiet dignity despite the danger surrounding them all. In the space of a few desperate hours, this warrior had become more than just their protector. He had become the embodiment of everything she'd never dared hope to find in a man's strength. Without cruelty, protection, without possession, courage tempered by gentleness and wisdom. "I promise," Bertha whispered. And the words carried the weight of something deeper than mere agreement, something that acknowledged the connection that had been forged between them in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. Her fingers brushed his as she spoke, and the brief contact sent warmth shooting through both of them, a connection that transcended the desperate circumstances of their meeting and spoke to possibilities that neither had dared imagine before tonight. As Nayati disappeared into the night to retrieve the surveys and begin his desperate gambit to save them all, none of them could have imagined how the promise between them would ultimately be tested, or how the love that had been born in violence and nurtured by shared courage would eventually reshape not just their own lives, but the entire future of the Arizona Territory. The journey to Flagstaff began in darkness, deeper than any Bertha had ever experienced with Ruth, leading them along deer trails and cattle paths that hadn't seen human traffic in months. The rancher moved with sure instincts born of 30 years' survival on the frontier, navigating by stars and landmarks that existed only in the memories of old-timers who had been there when the land was still truly wild and unforgiving. Bertha rode behind Ruth on a gentle mare that the rancher had selected specifically for its steady temperament. The twins secured in specially padded saddlebags that muffled any sounds they might make while protecting them from the worst jolts of travel. The babies had proven remarkably resilient during their first hours of life. But their mother was struggling with the aftermath of a difficult birth and the emotional weight of leaving behind the man who had risked everything to protect them. The first 20 miles passed without incident, following ancient game trails through country that seemed carved from moonlight and shadow. But as dawn approached, bringing with it the need to seek shelter before they could be spotted by searching eyes, they encountered the first of several obstacles that would test both women's determination and resourcefulness. The Gila River, normally little more than a trickling creek during the drought months, had been transformed by the previous night storms into a raging torrent that blocked their path completely. The bridge they had planned to use was gone, swept away by floodwaters that still ran brown with mud and debris from the mountains. "We'll have to find another crossing," Ruth said grimly, studying the swollen water course with the eye of someone who had seen flash floods claim both animals and men who underestimated their power. "But that'll add 6 hours to our journey, maybe 8, and we can't afford the time." It was Bertha who spotted the solution. A place where the flood had deposited a massive tree trunk across a narrow section of the river, creating a natural bridge that might support their weight if they were careful and very lucky. "I can walk it," she said quietly, surprising Ruth with a steadiness in her voice. "If you can get the horses across downstream where it's shallower, I can carry the babies one at a time." "That's crazy," Ruth protested. "You just gave birth hours ago. You're in no condition for that kind of risk." But Bertha was already dismounting her movements, careful but determined, as she prepared to face a challenge that would have seemed impossible just days before. "I'm in no condition for a lot of things," she replied, "but those babies are my responsibility, and I won't let them down." What followed was an hour of heart-stopping tension as Bertha made 3 separate crossings of the improvised bridge twice, carrying a baby, once returning for supplies they couldn't afford to lose. Each crossing was a test of balance, courage, and maternal determination that transformed the frightened woman from the cabin into something stronger and more capable than she had ever imagined possible. Ruth watched from the far bank with her rifle ready, knowing that if Bertha fell, there would be no way to save her from the churning waters below. But she also watched with growing admiration for the kind of courage that came not from the absence of fear, but from the refusal to let fear determine the outcome. When children's lives hung in the balance. "Where did that come from?" Ruth asked when Bertha finally reached safety with both babies secure in her arms. "I don't know," Bertha replied honestly, looking back at the crossing she had just accomplished with something approaching amazement. "I just kept thinking about what Nayati would do. He wouldn't give up, wouldn't let obstacles stop him from keeping his word. So neither could I." They found shelter in a cave system that Ruth remembered from her early days in the territory, a hidden refuge that had served her family during Apache troubles decades earlier. The caves provided protection from both weather and searching eyes, but they also forced the 2 women into closer quarters than they had shared before, creating opportunities for the kind of conversation that revealed character and forged lasting bonds. As they settled the babies for rest and prepared to wait out the daylight hours, Ruth found herself studying her companion with new eyes. The transformation she had witnessed at the river crossing wasn't temporary or superficial. Something fundamental had changed in Bertha Marchand, something that went deeper than circumstances and spoke to inner strength that had been awakened by necessity and tempered by courage. "Tell me about your life before this," Bertha said quietly, as they kept watch while the baby slept. "Before the territory, before the hardship. What brought you west?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert landscape that had shaped her for 30 years. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of memories that had been carefully guarded for decades. "I came west with my first husband in '58. She began slowly. "David was a good man, believed in building something better for our children out here, where land was cheap and opportunity was supposed to be limitless. We had 3 young ones then, 2 boys and a girl, all under 10 years old." She paused, choosing her words carefully, the understanding that some stories needed to be told exactly right to honor the people they described. Apache troubles were bad that year, raids on isolated ranches, families disappearing without trace, livestock stolen or slaughtered just to send messages about who really controlled the territory. David thought our place was too remote to be noticed. Thought we could keep our heads down and avoid trouble by not taking sides in other people's wars. Bertha could hear the pain in Ruth's voice, the weight of old grief that had been carried for too many years. "They came on a Tuesday morning in September," Ruth continued. "David was checking the south pasture. I was doing laundry by the creek. The children were playing in the yard, laughing about something I can't even remember now. Then I heard Sarah scream, and when I looked up, there were 6 painted warriors between me and my babies. The story that followed was one of violence and loss, but also of survival and the kind of desperate courage that frontier life demanded from those who were determined to endure. Ruth's husband had died trying to protect his family. Her youngest son had been killed in the first moments of the attack, but she had managed to save her daughter and older boy by hiding them in a root cellar while she drew the raiders away with gunfire that brought help from neighboring ranchers. That was the day I learned that waiting for someone else to save you is just another way of dying, Ruth concluded. From then on, I made sure I could protect what mattered to me, no matter what it cost or how much it changed me. The conversation continued through the long day, with each woman sharing pieces of her past that explained how they had become the people sitting in that cave. Bertha talked about her father's dream of educating frontier children, her mother's involvement in the suffrage movement, and her own naive belief that love could transform even the most damaged person if given enough time and patience. "I thought I could save Jean," she admitted, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. "Thought I could be the anchor that kept him from drifting into worse and worse choices. But you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, can you?" "No," Ruth agreed gently, "but you can save yourself, and you can save your children. That's what you're doing now." As they prepared to resume their journey under cover of darkness, both women understood that something important had passed between them. Not just shared stories, but a recognition of kindred spirits who had been tested by circumstances beyond their control, and had chosen courage over surrender, hope over despair. The bond they had forged would sustain them through the trials ahead, but it would also change them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Ruth had found someone worth mentoring and protecting, while Bertha had discovered inner strength she never knew she possessed, and a vision of what she might become when she was no longer defined by other people's limitations and expectations. Meanwhile, 50 mi to the south, Nayati was leading Sheriff Vernon Carnes and his men on a pursuit that had become something approaching an art form. The warrior's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity: stay visible enough to keep them committed to the chase, but always remained just out of rifle range, drawing them further from Flagstaff with each passing hour, while gradually wearing down both horses and riders. He had begun by heading south toward the Mexican border, exactly as Pete Holloway's tracking skills suggested he would. But instead of following straight lines, Nayati wove a complex path through arroyos and canyon systems that forced his pursuers to ride single file, preventing them from spreading out and surrounding him, while also slowing their overall progress. The pattern served multiple purposes beyond simple evasion. Every hour that Karn spent chasing shadows was another hour closer to safety for Bertha and her daughters. But there was something else driving Nayati forward through the punishing heat and treacherous terrain, and the memory of blue eyes filled with trust and gratitude, the touch of soft fingers against his wrist, the way Bertha had looked at him as if he might actually be the hero she needed him to be. Pete Holloway had been tracking men and animals for 20 years, and he had never encountered anyone quite like the Cheyenne warrior they were pursuing. The Indian's trail was a masterpiece of misdirection, visible enough to follow, but complex enough to slow them down with subtle false leads that forced the tracking party to backtrack and verify their route at crucial moments. "He's good," Holloway admitted to Sheriff Carnes as they paused to rest their horses beside a waterhole that their quarry had visited. "Hours earlier. Best I've ever seen. And I've tracked Apache war parties through country that would make a mountain goat think twice about proceeding." Karna studied the tracks around the waterhole, his weathered face showing frustration that had been building for 2 days of pursuit that seemed to lead nowhere except deeper into hostile territory. There was something about this chase that felt personal in a way that went beyond simple law enforcement, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was bothering him about the whole situation. But Holloway was studying the Indian's trail with something approaching professional admiration, his experienced eyes reading sign that told a story of tactical brilliance and physical endurance that commanded respect even from enemies. "You know what's interesting about this particular redskin?" Holloway continued, ignoring his boss's obvious irritation. "He's not trying to lose us completely. A tracker this good could disappear any time he wanted to vanish into country where even I couldn't follow. But he's staying just visible enough to keep us following, leading us on like he's got some kind of purpose beyond just getting away." The observation sent a chill through Carnes that had nothing to do with the desert night that was beginning to settle over the landscape. If the Indian was deliberately leading them on a chase, then someone else was the real target, someone who needed time to reach safety while professional manhunters were occupied elsewhere. "You think he's protecting something?" Carnes asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Or someone," Holloway replied grimly. "Question is, what do we do about it? Keep following him deeper into nowhere, or cut our losses and head back to where the real action might be?" It was a tactical decision that would determine the outcome of everything that followed, and Carnes found himself wrestling with considerations that went far beyond simple pursuit of a fugitive. His stepfather's instructions had been clear: recover the water surveys and eliminate any witnesses who might testify about Blount's illegal activities. But there was something about this particular chase that was stirring memories and emotions he had tried hard to suppress. As they made camp for the night, Carnes found himself thinking about his brother Thomas for the first time in months. Not the idealized version he had created to justify his quest for vengeance, but the real Thomas, cruel, drunken, violent, taking pleasure in hurting things that couldn't fight back. He had known what kind of man his brother was, had always known, but family loyalty and his own need for connection had blinded him to truths that were becoming harder to ignore. The decision to continue the pursuit came not from tactical considerations, but from something deeper, a need to face the man who had killed his brother and settle accounts that went beyond simple revenge into questions of justice, family honor, and the kind of man Vernon Carnes wanted to be when the final reckoning came. That reckoning came sooner than anyone expected. On the second afternoon, when the heat had turned the desert into a shimmering oven that tested the endurance of both hunter and hunted, Pete Holloway's Winchester cracked across the silence like thunder. The bullet took Nayat's horse in the shoulder, sending the animal stumbling and crashing in a spray of blood and dust that marked the end of the mounted phase of their deadly game. The warrior rolled clear with fluid grace that spoke of long experience, with violent dismounts, his own rifle in his hands, and his medicine pouch still secure across his shoulder. Now he was afoot in hostile country, with 4 mounted men closing from different directions like wolves converging on wounded prey. By any reasonable calculation, his situation was hopeless. 1 man against 4 on foot against mounted opponents in terrain that offered little cover and no chance of escape. But the Cheyenne had not survived 30 years of frontier warfare by accepting other people's calculations of what was possible. As his pursuers spread out to surround him, Nayati did something none of them expected. He began to climb. The landscape where his horse had fallen was dominated by a massive stone formation that rose from the desert floor like a prehistoric monument to forces beyond human understanding. The rock face was nearly vertical, broken by narrow ledges and crevices that would challenge even experienced climbers with proper equipment and unlimited time. But Nayati had learned his climbing skills in the Badlands of Montana, where survival often meant reaching places that enemies couldn't follow, and he moved upward with the efficiency of a man who understood that rock could be both enemy and ally, depending on how it was approached. Carnes and his men reached the base of the formation just as the warrior disappeared over the first major ledge 60 ft above their heads. The sheriff's curses echoed off the stone walls as he realized their horses would be useless for this phase of the pursuit. "Dismount and follow him." Upper Elm Carnes ordered, his voice cracking with frustration that had been building for days. He's got nowhere to go but up, and that climb will kill him faster than our bullets if we just keep the pressure on. It was sound tactical thinking, but it failed to account for Nayati's intimate knowledge of stone and sky skills learned from childhood games that had become survival tools in adult warfare. While his pursuers struggled with unfamiliar vertical terrain, fighting gravity and their own limitations, the warrior moved upward with practiced efficiency. Pete Holloway paused in his climb to study the handholds above him, his professional mind analyzing the challenge they faced with growing respect for their quarry's abilities. "Sheriff," he called down to Carnes, "this Indian knows what he's doing up here. This ain't his first time on stone like this, and he's leading us somewhere specific." "Just keep climbing," Carnes replied through gritted teeth, his own hands already bleeding from the rough sandstone. But privately he was beginning to understand that they had been led into terrain that favored their quarry, not them. The chase became a three-dimensional puzzle played out against Arizona's most unforgiving landscape, with each move requiring careful calculation of strength, balance, and endurance. Nayati climbed steadily higher, always staying just out of rifle range while using every crack and overhang to maintain his advantage over pursuers who were fighting unfamiliar terrain with inadequate preparation. But the warrior wasn't just buying time with his vertical flight, he was leading them towards something specific. A destination that would turn the nature of their deadly game completely around and force a confrontation that had been years in the making. The ancient Anastasi ruins, perched on a ledge 400 ft above the desert floor, seemed to grow from the cliff face itself, their stone walls and towers blending seamlessly with natural rock formations that had protected them from wind and weather for centuries before the first European had ever set foot in the territory. Nayati reached the ruins just as the last light faded from the western sky, his pursuers still struggling up the treacherous cliff face below him, like ants trying to scale a wall that had been designed to keep them out. The warrior had visited this place before during his travels through the territory, and he knew its secrets, hidden chambers, narrow passages, and most importantly, a spring of clear water that had sustained the ancient people who once called this place home. But it wasn't water or shelter that had drawn him here tonight. It was the strategic advantage the ruins offered, a defensive position that could be held by one man against many, at least for a while, and a place where the final confrontation between past and present could be settled according to older laws than those written in territorial statute books. Carnes and his three remaining men reached the ledge an hour after full darkness, exhausted from the climb and frustrated by their quarry's continued evasion. The sheriff had lost one man to a fall during the ascent. Not killed, but injured badly enough to be out of the fight and possibly out of commission permanently. The others showed the strain that came from pushing beyond normal limits while climbing terrain that demanded constant attention to balance and handholds. "He's here somewhere," Carnes muttered, studying the ruins by moonlight that turned the ancient stone silver and black, creating shadows that could hide an army or conceal nothing at all. Nowhere else to go from here except straight down. And that's a jump no man survives. Pete Holloway examined the ground with professional interest, despite the poor light his experienced eyes reading sign that would have been invisible to less skilled trackers. Trail says he went inside, but these old buildings are like a maze designed by people who knew how to confuse enemies. Could be hiding anywhere, or he could have found some way through to the backside of the cliff. The Anastasia had indeed built their city to take advantage of every natural feature of the cliff face, creating a complex of interconnected rooms and passages that folded back on themselves in impossible ways, designed to confuse invaders and provide multiple routes of escape for defenders who knew the layout. As Carnes and his men began their systematic search of the ruins, Nayat was already implementing the next phase of his plan. He had positioned himself in a chamber that commanded views of the main approaches to the ancient city, while also providing access to narrow passages that led to different sections of the complex. From his hidden position, he could observe his enemies' movements while remaining completely invisible to their searching eyes. But observation wasn't enough for what he had in mind. He needed to keep them here engaged in futile pursuit while precious hours ticked toward dawn and Bertha's safe arrival in Flagstaff. That meant taking risks that violated every survival rule he'd ever learned, drawing them deeper into the maze while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that would end with his death and their freedom to pursue more vulnerable targets. The first stone struck the ground near Pete Holloway with a sharp crack that echoed off the ancient walls like a gunshot in a cathedral. The tracker spun toward the sound, his rifle ready, but saw only shadows and moonlight playing tricks among the ruins. A few seconds later, another stone clattered in a different direction, drawing the attention of another searcher toward a completely different section of the complex. "He's playing games with us," Carnes growled. But there was uncertainty in his voice now, the kind of doubt that came from being led into unfamiliar territory by someone who understood the terrain better than you did. The sounds could be wind-displaced rocks, or they could be evidence of a man moving through the ruins with ghostly stealth leading them deeper into a trap they couldn't see. Nayati continued his campaign of harassment, using the ancient building's acoustic properties to create confusion and misdirection that kept his enemies off balance and reactive rather than proactive. A whistle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The scrape of leather against stone that suggested movement in a dozen different directions. The soft sound of displaced pebbles that drew the searchers deeper into the maze of abandoned rooms where echoes could lie and shadows could kill. Hours passed in this deadly game of hide and seek, with the hunters becoming increasingly frustrated by their inability to corner their elusive prey. They were experienced men accustomed to dealing with desperate criminals and hostile Indians, but they had never faced an opponent who combined wilderness skills with intimate knowledge of terrain that had been designed by ancient architects to confuse and disorient invaders. As dawn approached, bringing with it the possibility of Bertha's safe arrival in Flagstaff and the success of everything they had risked to achieve, Carnes finally admitted what they all knew. They had been outmaneuvered by a single warrior who was playing by rules they didn't understand. But that didn't mean he was ready to surrender or retreat. It just meant he was ready to change the rules of engagement and force a confrontation that would settle accounts that had been 3 years in the making. "I know you can hear me, Indian," the sheriff called his voice, carrying clearly through the ruins and echoing off stone walls that had witnessed countless acts of courage and cowardice over the centuries. "So listen carefully, because I've got something to tell you that might change your mind about this whole situation." Carnes paused, letting his words echo off the ancient stones before continuing his voice, carrying the weight of emotions that had been building for years. In that moment of silence, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that had been building throughout the pursuit, finally crystallizing into terrible certainty. "You know what? I just realized who you are." He continued his voice, dropping to something more dangerous than mere anger, something that spoke to personal grievances that went deeper than professional duty. "Took me a while to place you, but I never forget the face of the man who killed my brother." The revelation hung in the morning air like smoke from a gunshot that had been fired 3 years too late. From his hidden position among the ruins, Nayati felt the pieces of a long puzzle finally clicking into place. With the inevitability of fate itself, understanding at last why this pursuit had felt so personal from the beginning. "That's right, Indian." Carnes called his voice thick with years of accumulated grief and rage that had finally found their target. 3 years ago, up in Montana Territory, a Cheyenne warrior killed my brother Thomas outside a trading post. Beat him to death over some damn horse that wasn't worth a plugged nickel to anyone except maybe the savage who owned it. Pete Holloway and the other men shifted, uncomfortably, suddenly understanding that this pursuit had never been just about debt collection or territorial corruption. It had been about family blood, about scores that demanded settling regardless of larger consequences or collateral damage, about the kind of vengeance that could consume a man's soul if he wasn't careful about how he pursued it. But there was something else in Kern's voice now, something that went beyond simple vengeance and spoke to deeper conflicts that had been tearing at him for years. As he continued speaking, his words revealed a man who had been wrestling with demons of his own for far too long. "You want to know the real hell of it?" The sheriff continued, his voice cracking with emotions he'd kept buried for too long. "I knew what kind of man Thomas was. Knew he drank too much, fought too much, hurt things that couldn't fight back. Knew he left that boy of his alone too much while he went looking for trouble in every saloon and wee house from here to Canada." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with the kind of truth that family members carried, but rarely spoke aloud, to the acknowledgement of flaws and failures that love couldn't quite excuse or forget. "But he was my little brother," Carnes continued. And now there were tears in his voice, along with the rage, the complex emotions of a man trying to reconcile family loyalty with moral truth. "Blood of my blood, no matter what else he was. And you killed him. You took him away from that boy who needed a father, even if that father wasn't worth much." From his hiding place, Nayati understood the terrible irony of what was happening. Both men were haunted by the same ghost, the child left fatherless, by a moment of violence that had escalated beyond anyone's control or intention. The difference was that Nayati had been trying to atone for that moment ever since, while Carnes had been using it to justify 3 years of increasingly corrupt behavior. "Here's what's going to happen." Carnes called, his voice steadying with the certainty of a man who had finally found his life's purpose. "You're going to come out of those ruins, and you're going to face me like a man. One-on-one, no weapons, just like how you killed Thomas. Give you the same chance you gave him." The challenge echoed off stone walls that had witnessed countless acts of courage and cowardice over the centuries, carrying with it the weight of ancient laws that predated territorial governments and federal jurisdiction. Nayati understood the trap being laid. Carnes knew that a warrior's honor would compel him to accept single combat, even when tactical wisdom demanded continued evasion. But there was something else driving the confrontation now. Something that spoke to the debt of guilt that Nayati had been carrying for 3 years, and the need to finally settle accounts that had been left unbalanced for too long. The warrior emerged from his hiding place with empty hands, stepping into pale morning sunlight that painted the ancient ruins gold and crimson like the sacred colors of his people. He moved with the dignity of a man who had finally found his destiny, regardless of what that destiny might cost him personally. "Your brother chose his own death," Nayati said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the stone ledge, with the authority of absolute truth. "He was killing a horse, beating it to death for his own pleasure when no one else was watching. I tried to stop him with words first, with he pulled a knife. Liar." Karna snarled, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew his brother's true nature all too well, had always known it. Despite his refusal to acknowledge it publicly or even privately, he was drunk, angry, wanted to hurt something weaker than himself, because that's what made him feel strong. Nayati continued with the patient tone of a man speaking truth regardless of consequences. "When I interfered, he came at me with steel in his hand and murder in his heart. I had no choice but to defend myself." The explanation hung between them like a bridge that neither man could cross, though both understood its essential truth. Carnes wanted to believe his brother had been the victim of unprovoked savagery, but the warrior's calm recounting of events had the ring of honesty that couldn't be denied by anyone who had known Thomas Carnes. He left a son behind, Nayati added softly, his voice carrying genuine regret that had haunted him for 3 years. A boy who needed his father, no matter what kind of man that father was. That boy's face has been in my dreams ever since, asking me why I took away the only family he had. Pretty words, Carnes replied, but his voice had lost some of its venom as the warrior story resonated with memories he'd tried to suppress. Won't bring Thomas back. Won't make his boy's life any easier. No, Nayati agreed simply. Nothing can do that. But I've spent 3 years trying to atone for taking one life by preserving as many others as possible. The woman and babies I've been protecting, they represent my chance at balancing the scales and making my brother's death mean something more than just another frontier killing. The warrior took a step forward, his hands still empty, his posture non-threatening despite the danger surrounding him. You want justice for your brother? Then let them go. Take me instead. One life for one life, and the innocent go free. It was then that Carnes spoke the words that would change everything, revealing the secret that explained his true connection to the corruption that had nearly destroyed the Marchand family. You know what the really twisted part is? Thomas wasn't even my full brother. Same mother, different fathers. Mine was a worthless drunk who ran off when I was 6 years old. But Thomas's father was Horace Blount. The revelation hit Nayati like a physical blow, explaining everything about the personal nature of this pursuit and the web of corruption that had ensnared so many innocent people. Everything suddenly made sense. Carnes's loyalty to Blount, despite his obvious discomfort with the man's methods, the personal stakes that had driven this chase across half the territory, the way the sheriff's face had softened when he looked at Bertha's babies. That's right. Carnes continued, seeing understanding dawn in the warrior's eyes. Horace Blount is my stepfather, though he never acknowledged it publicly, because it wouldn't have been good for business. Thomas was his legitimate son, the heir to his empire, the one who was supposed to carry on the family name and the family business. And you killed him. Sheriff Vernon Carnes drew his weapon with hands that shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of years spent carrying a burden he'd never fully understood until this moment. But as he raised the gun, Nayati did something unexpected. Instead of standing passive and accepting his fate with stoic resignation, the warrior smiled, not with resignation, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had just realized he held information that could change everything. Before you pull that trigger, Nayati said calmly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even enemies pause to listen. There's something you should know about your stepfather's business practices. Something I learned during my time tracking his operations across the territory. Carnes hesitated, his weapon wavering slightly, as curiosity warred with the need for vengeance that had driven him for 3 years. He's been selling children, Vernon, white children, Indian children, Mexican children. Doesn't matter to him, as long as they bring good prices from buyers who don't ask questions about origins. Your brother Thomas knew about it, was part of it, helped organize the whole trafficking network that's been stealing kids from isolated ranches and reservations. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Carnes thought he knew about his family, his loyalty, his purpose in pursuing this confrontation. The sheriff's face went white as the implications sank in, as he began to understand the true scope of the corruption he had been serving. You're lying, he said, but the words carried no conviction. I might check the records when you get back to Blount's operation. Look for a strong box hidden under the floorboards of the main office behind a panel that moves when you press the right spot on the wall. You'll find documents going back 5 years, names, dates, prices paid for human merchandise. Your brother's signature is on half of them, authorizing transactions that would make your stomach turn if you had any decency left. Karn's hand shook now, not with anger, but with the terrible certainty that everything he'd believed was crumbling around him like poorly built walls in an earthquake. In that moment of hesitation, of moral confusion, and dawning horror, Nayati put the second part of his desperate plan into motion. The gunshot echoed across the desert like thunder rolling through canyon walls. But when the smoke cleared, it wasn't the warrior who lay motionless on the ancient stones. Pete Holloway had put a bullet in Karn's back the instant the sheriff's weapon began to waver, his loyalty to Blount and his paycheck overriding any sentiment about family revelations or moral complications. "Sorry, Vernon," Holloway said without emotion, already turning his rifle toward Nayati. "But Mr. Blount pays my wages, and he don't appreciate loose ends that might cause him problems down the road." But what Holloway hadn't counted on was Nayati's intimate knowledge of the ruins. Knowledge that included escape routes the ancient builders had designed for exactly this kind of situation. As the tracker's rifle swung toward him, the warrior seemed to stumble and fall, rolling behind a low wall that concealed a narrow passage leading to the cliff's back face. Holloway's bullets struck empty stone where Nayati had been a moment before. The tracker moved forward cautiously, his rifle ready, but found only blood on the rocks, and what appeared to be a dead man's medicine pouch dropped in apparent haste. The passage behind the wall was too narrow for his shoulders, and after several minutes of futile searching, he concluded that the Indian had crawled in there to die from wounds that would finish him slowly and privately. What Holloway couldn't have known was that the blood came from a deliberate cut on Nayati's arm, carefully placed to suggest a more serious wound, and that the warrior's knowledge of healing trances, ancient techniques that slowed heartbeat and breathing to near-death levels, had saved his life more than once during his career as a fighter and survivor. The medicine pouch had been left deliberately along with enough blood to suggest a fatal wound, while Nayat used techniques passed down through generations of Cheyenne warriors to appear dead while actually preserving life. By the time federal authorities reached the ruins 2 days later, drawn by reports of gunfire and the discovery of 2 bodies on the ancient ledge, they found only Pete Holloway's carefully constructed account of events. Sheriff Carnes had cornered the Indian fugitive in the ruins and killed him in a fair fight, then been shot by other members of the warriors' band seeking revenge for their fallen leader. The tracker's story was believed because it was convenient, because it tied up loose ends that federal investigators didn't want to pursue too deeply, and because there was no evidence to contradict his version of events. Nayati's body was never found, leading to speculation that he had crawled away to die in some hidden canyon, or that his people had retrieved it for burial, according to tribal custom. What no one suspected was that the warrior had made his way down the back face of the cliff, using routes known only to him and a few other experienced climbers, then hidden in cave systems that had sheltered his ancestors during times of war and persecution. His survival was aided by knowledge passed down through generations of Cheyenne healers' techniques for treating wounds, managing pain, and maintaining life even when death seemed certain and escape impossible. For 3 weeks, Nayat remained hidden in the desert, slowly recovering from his wounds, while news of the events in Flagstaff reached him through friendly traders and sympathetic ranchers who moved through the territory like an informal intelligence network. He learned that Bertha and her daughters had reached safety, that federal investigations had begun, and that Horace Blount Empire was finally crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. But he also learned something else, something that made his heart race with emotions he'd thought were buried forever beneath layers of warrior discipline and protective detachment. Bertha had refused to believe reports of his death, insisting to anyone who would listen that Nayat was too skilled a warrior and too determined a protector to die so easily. She had even convinced federal authorities to continue searching for him, offering her own testimony about his survival skills and intimate knowledge of the Territo's hidden places. It was that faith, that absolute refusal to give up on him, that finally convinced Nayati to emerge from his desert sanctuary and make his way to Flagstaff. He arrived on the day of Horace Blount's trial, slipping into the courthouse like a ghost, returning from another world to settle accounts that had been left unfinished. In Flagstaff, word of Blount's activities had spread like wildfire through a community that had lived under his shadow for too long. Citizens who had never taken sides in territorial politics were taking sides now, understanding finally that their silence had enabled corruption that threatened everything they had worked to build. Marshal Thomas Brennan had arrived from New Mexico with U.S. Marshals with a small cavalry detachment under territorial authority. But instead of finding a simple law enforcement situation, he had discovered what amounted to a territorial rebellion that required the kind of decisive action that would reshape the region's political landscape for generations. The townspeople had spent days preparing defenses against Blount's expected retaliation, turning every building into a potential fortress and every street into a battlefield, where local knowledge mattered more than professional training. Barricades appeared across the main approaches. Rifle positions were established in key buildings, and ammunition was distributed to anyone willing to stand against the corruption that had poisoned their community for too long. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had turned her medical practice into a field hospital, working alongside volunteers to prepare for casualties that seemed inevitable. Judge Harrison Webb had established a command post in the courthouse, coordinating defense preparations with the methodical precision of someone who understood that this battle would determine whether law or corruption would rule the territory for years to come. But the real drama was unfolding in courtrooms and meeting halls where evidence of systematic corruption was being presented to federal prosecutors who had the authority and determination to act on what they learned. Jean Marchand's testimony had been devastating, providing detailed documentation of water rights, fraud that stretched back years and affected hundreds of legitimate settlers and businesses. Ruth Calloway had testified about the attacks on her ranch and the systematic intimidation of honest citizens who had tried to resist Blount's expansion. Dr. Mitchell had provided medical evidence of abuse suffered by trafficking victims who had finally found the courage to speak publicly about their experiences. But it was Bertha's testimony that had captured national attention and transformed a regional corruption case into a symbol of everything decent people were fighting to protect. Her quiet dignity, her refusal to be intimidated by high-priced attorneys, and her passionate defense of her children's right to safety had made her a symbol of maternal courage that resonated with audiences far beyond the Arizona territory. The prosecution was preparing to rest its case when a commotion at the back of the courtroom drew everyone's attention. A man had entered, tall, proud, wearing buckskin and beadwork that identified him as Cheyenne, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had survived challenges that would have destroyed lesser men. But it was his face that caused the real stir, because half the people in the room recognized him from newspaper descriptions of the warrior who had supposedly died in the desert ruins 3 weeks earlier. Bertha's gasp was audible throughout the packed courtroom as she recognized the man who had saved her life and captured her heart in ways she was only beginning to understand. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and the connection that had been forged in desperation and sealed in sacrifice blazed between them like a flame that death itself couldn't extinguish. "Your Honor," the federal prosecutor said, his voice tight with barely controlled excitement. "The prosecution would like to call one additional witness. Nayati, also known as Red Hawk of the Northern Cheyenne Nation." The murmur that ran through the courtroom was like controlled thunder, but it was nothing compared to the storm that broke when Nayati began his testimony. Speaking in clear, precise English that surprised those who had dismissed him as an ignorant savage, he provided first-hand evidence of Blount's criminal network that went far beyond anything the prosecution had previously been able to prove. He testified about the human trafficking operation with clinical detail, that left the courtroom in stunned silence, describing methods used to acquire and transport victims with the precision of someone who had studied the system from the inside. He provided names, dates, and locations that could be verified through federal records, creating a web of evidence that would take months to fully investigate. Most damning of all, he produced a leather portfolio that he had retrieved from Blount's private office during the chaos following the railroad ceremony, documents that proved the mine owner's involvement in crimes stretching back to the early days of territorial settlement when law enforcement was weak and federal oversight was practically non-existent. "How did you obtain these documents?" Blount's attorney demanded during cross-examination, his voice sharp with professional desperation. "I took them," Nayati replied simply, his dark eyes meeting the lawyer's gaze without flinching. "From your client's office after he ordered his men to kill innocent women and children for the crime of possessing information that could expose his criminal enterprise." "That's theft. That's justice." The warrior corrected his voice, carrying the kind of quiet authority that silenced even experienced courtroom performers. "Sometimes the law needs help from those who remember what it was meant to protect instead of who it was designed to serve." But it was Nayati's final revelation that sealed Blount's fate and exposed the full scope of the corruption that had poisoned the territory for years. Producing a letter from the portfolio, a letter written in Blount's own hand to Sheriff Vernon Carnes, he read aloud the mine owner's acknowledgement of paternity and his detailed instructions for covering up Thomas Carnes' involvement in the trafficking operation. "My son," the letter began, and the courtroom fell silent as the implications became clear. "I know you've never forgiven me for not claiming you publicly, but blood is blood, and family protects family. Thomas made mistakes, but he was your brother and my heir. The Indian who killed him must pay, but more importantly, we must ensure that Thomas's activities never come to light." The letter went on to detail plans for eliminating witnesses, destroying evidence, and maintaining the fiction that Horace Blount was a legitimate businessman rather than the architect of a territorial-wide criminal conspiracy that had corrupted law enforcement, victimized the innocent, and perverted justice for personal profit. When Nayati finished reading, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Bertha weeping. Not from sorrow, but from overwhelming relief that the man she had come to love was alive, and that justice was finally being served in a way that would protect her children and countless others from the predators who had stalked them. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Horace Blount was sentenced to life imprisonment in the federal penitentiary. His mining empire was dissolved and its assets distributed to compensate victims, and the network of corruption he had built over decades was systematically dismantled by federal investigators who had the authority and determination to see justice served. But for Bertha, the most important moment came after the trial, when she and Nayati finally had a chance to speak privately in the courthouse garden while her daughters played in the grass nearby. The twins were thriving now, growing strong and healthy under the care of people who understood their value as human beings rather than their utility as commodities. "I thought you were dead," she said simply, her voice breaking with emotions too powerful for elaborate words, too deep for anything but simple truth. "I was," he replied, stepping closer until he could see the tears sparkling in her eyes like stars reflected in desert pools. "Everything that mattered to me was in that courtroom, believing I would never come back. That kind of death is worse than anything a bullet can do to a man's body." She looked up at him, then seeing not just the warrior who had saved her life, but the man who had shown her what love could be when it was built on mutual respect and shared courage rather than fear, and dependency on partnership rather than ownership. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer, afraid that the differences between their worlds might prove stronger than the connection they had forged in fire and blood. "Now we build something better," he said, reaching out to touch her face with the same gentle hands that had delivered her daughters and fought to protect their future. "If you'll have me, if you can see past the differences that the world says should keep us apart and look instead at what we've already built together." Her answer was a smile that outshone the desert sunset, followed by words that would bind them together more completely than any legal ceremony or social convention. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The marriage of Bertha Martian and Nayati Redhawk took place 6 months later in the new courthouse in Flagstaff, performed by a federal judge and attended by citizens who had come to understand that true nobility had nothing to do with blood or birth, and everything to do with choices made in moments when character mattered more than comfort. Jean Marchand, released early from prison for his cooperation with federal authorities, and his final act of courage in exposing Blount's operations, gave away the bride with tears in his eyes and genuine joy in his heart. He had found his own redemption through honest work and the knowledge that his daughters would grow up in a world shaped by justice rather than corruption. Ruth Calloway stood as matron of honor, her weathered face bright with happiness for the woman she had come to love as a daughter. Dorsatra Sarah Mitchell served as witness, along with dozens of citizens who had learned that heroes came in many forms and that courage was contagious when people found the strength to stand together against injustice. But it was the twins themselves who provided the most touching moment of the ceremony. Mary, Nayati, and Sarah Ruth, now sturdy children who had never known a world where their mother was afraid, reached for their new father with complete trust and acceptance, sealing a bond that had been forged in violence, but tempered by love, into something unbreakable. Years passed, and the Arizona Territory was officially granted statehood in 1912, 25 years after the events that had nearly destroyed the Marchand family and transformed them into something stronger. By then, Na and Bertha were respected leaders in their community. Their mixed marriage accepted as a symbol of the state's evolution from a lawless frontier into a place where justice and equality were more than just words. Their work together had helped draft legislation that became the foundation for Native American legal protections in the Southwest, establishing schools, medical facilities, and legal aid services that served both white and Indian communities. They had proven that love could bridge any divide when it was built on genuine respect and shared commitment to making the world better for future generations. On the day Arizona became a state, they stood together on the steps of the Capitol building in Phoenix, watching their children play with other youngsters whose futures had been secured by the sacrifices of an earlier generation. The twins, now young women attending the state university, had inherited their mother's intelligence and their father's quiet strength. Their younger siblings showed signs of becoming natural leaders, equally comfortable in both cultures that had shaped their heritage. "Do you ever regret it?" Bertha asked her husband as they watched the celebration unfold around them, the culmination of decades of work to build something better than what they had found. "Giving up the traditional ways of your people to help build this new world." Nayati smiled, the same gentle expression that had first captured her heart in a cabin during a desperate night that seemed like a lifetime ago. "I didn't give up my people's ways," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom that came from successfully bridging two worlds. "I found a way to honor them in a changing world. The Cheyenne have always believed that our actions should serve the next 7 generations. Everything we've built here serves that purpose." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes holding all the love and gratitude that 25 years of marriage had only deepened and strengthened. "Besides, I found something worth more than tradition or comfort or safety. I found a woman who was willing to fight for her children's future and who taught me that love could be stronger than any law or custom or prejudice that tried to divide us. As the sun set over the desert landscape, they had both learned to call home. Bertha leaned against her husband's shoulder and watched their children laugh with the carefree joy of people who had never known systematic injustice or institutionalized corruption. It had been a long journey from that night when a Cheyenne warrior had stumbled into their cabin and changed the course of their lives forever. But every step of that journey had been worth taking because it had led to this moment. A moment when love had proven stronger than hatred, when justice had triumphed over corruption, and when two people from different worlds had found a way to build something better together than either could have achieved alone. The scars of their early struggles had never completely faded, but they had been transformed from sources of pain into reminders of strength, from symbols of what they had survived into promises of what they could accomplish when they worked together toward common goals. The Arizona they were leaving to their children was not perfect, but it was infinitely better than the territory they had found, a place where the rule of law meant more than the size of a person's bank account, where children could grow up safe from those who would exploit their innocence, and where love could overcome any obstacle. When it was built on the foundation of mutual respect and shared courage, that was enough. That would always be enough.